Hello again, friends. Today I'm going to read out a letter to the Chief Justice, and most of it is self-explanatory. It comes on the back of the latest contrived attempt by the establishment, literally, to ban me from going up to the forecourts. It'll be explained when you hear my response. This is ludicrous, guys. It's ridiculous. It's obviously unlawful and unconstitutional, and it's just more of the dodgy tricks and devious ways that these so-called establishment figures do business on a daily basis. Now, just before I start, guys, I also want to thank everyone that turned up in support in Galway at the weekend, because as an exercise in free speech, I believe it was a marked success, regardless of whether we all agree completely with each other. The main point is that we still have these platforms where we can come out, and people are good enough to organise these events and invite some of us to come and speak. Obviously, we have to make the best of these opportunities while we still have the freedoms to do so. Anyway, on to the letter. The letter in question came from a Mr. Thomas Ward. Now, Thomas Ward can be found on pages 116 and 117 of the Criminality in the Irish Courts book, where you can see why he's gotten a mention in the book. Basically, he is a typical example. He was a principal officer at the time up in the court service, but he's a typical example of how the bad guys at the top keep getting away with what they're doing, because they couldn't do it without the support of tier after tier of bureaucrats, and I might add compromised bureaucrats, who are willing, if you like, to sell their proverbial souls in order to curry favour with these rogue elements that work for the state. So anyway, basically, Mr. Ward sent me this letter wherein here we go, wherein he basically tells me that from now on I will not be allowed entry into the forecourts, basically because my behaviour is such that we're putting all of the court users in grave peril, etc., etc. So I decided that, first of all, I wrote back to Mr. Ward, first of all, telling him we would make an exception on this one occasion and respond to him purely on the basis that there was a chance, an outside chance, that he didn't realise that he had already been proscribed and therefore he's lost his privileges. But we followed it up with a letter to the Chief Justice, Frank Clark. Now, this is how you do it, guys, okay? You don't have respect for malefactors and wrongdoers, no matter what their position is in agencies of the state. You can, of course, respect the office that they hold, but if that individual in that office is committing crimes, deceiving you, abusing the law, and denying you your fundamental rights, then what fool continues to genuflect and bow and curtsy and ask them for favours? We've got to stop doing this, guys. Anyway, here's the text of my letter to the Chief Justice. Dear Chief Justice, Mr. Clark, Frank, we hereby place you formally on notice, yet again, in your role as Chair of the Court Service Board and as the Chief Justice, that we will not knowingly engage with liars or moral deviants who are engaged in attempts to pervert justice, for to do so would place us at risk of complicity, etc., etc. Accordingly, we attach for your reference a copy of a letter from one Mr. Tom Ward, Head of Superior Court Operations at the Court Service. And you remember, folks, how we mentioned that these people invariably seem to be getting promoted. Plus our provisional response to it, asking you the simple question as to whether or not you personally condone these shabby, infantile, preposterous and utterly devious attempts to deny us justice across the board. Because not only have we been serially discriminated against, lied to and misled by senior agents of the court service in open collaboration with dishonest and disreputable judges, but the very same actors are now trying to scapegoat us for all of the cowardly and venal criminality that has been visited upon us, when the plain fact of the matter is that we are the only people in the equation who are actually abiding by the law. We have long since passed the point, Mr. Clark, where there is any question as to the absence of the rule of law in this state. And this, in large part, is due to your own repeat lapses and failures, as well as those of the political establishment, to apply and uphold the rule of law in knowledge of multiple unlawful and criminal acts by corrupt judges and their collaborators, as you very well know. Accordingly, and in anticipation of whatever Machiavellian motives are behind this latest insult to our intelligence, we refer briefly to the following numbered points in Mr. Ward's contrived and specious document for the record, as well as for the appraisal of the People's Tribunal of Ireland, which, thanks in large part to the inability of any of the so-called authorities up there to be able to lawfully object to its inauguration, and due to your collective failures to provide any formal authority for the jurisdiction of the domestic courts, as per the absent 1924 commencement order, the People's Tribunal of Ireland is now the sole legitimate legal authority in this state, with authority and jurisdiction over any rogue agency or agent of the state. Yes, up to and including dishonest and disreputable Supreme Court judges, Mr. Clark, due to the simple and undeniable fact that the PTI respects the law and abides by the rule of law, whilst far too many compromised individuals affiliated with the state do not. A. Who does Mr. Ward think he is to presume to write to us so impertinently in the first place? Notwithstanding the fact that he already features as a lead facilitator of criminal cover-ups in the Criminality book, Mr. Ward is a public servant, is he not? It rather appears that Mr. Ward has somewhat lost the run of himself in his newly appointed role as judge and jury of matters which he fully knows he is misrepresenting, as per usual. One could almost believe the suggestion that his letter was co-authored by McGrath, Binchy, Noonan, Humphreys, or O'Donnell, such is the similarity in content and form to much that has disingenuously issued at their hands in context of these cases. B. Yes, we did alert the public that we intended to lawfully arrest anyone who was engaged in criminal activity. But why would Mr. Ward, the supposed head of Superior Court Operations, have any problem with that? The authorities are clearly failing and refusing to deal with those who are obstructing and perverting justice, whilst masquerading as officers of the court, right? So, either the people will have to do something lawfully about it, or we become complicit in those crimes. Right, Frank? C. This is where Mr. Ward implies that we're a danger to the people up in the High Court. C. This is another misleading statement by Mr. Ward in his desperate attempt to rewrite the script. The fact is that we were being stonewalled by the court service, and High Court motions we had sent in for processing had been unlawfully held up in violation of Section 7.1 of the Criminal Law Act, which is interfering in a legitimate prosecution. Very serious offence, guys. On the day in question, we had already appeared in the High Court in the fiasco before McGrath. I then returned to the central office to try to find out why no one was responding to our urgent calls, texts and emails seeking an appointment. And more importantly, where our High Court motion documents for that day had somehow disappeared to. A few people followed me inside the four courts, certainly less than a dozen. I did not ask them to accompany me, and none of us went into the central office. I spoke alone with a helpful member of staff at the office door, just to confirm that he didn't have anything for us to collect. There was no breach of the COVID regulations, and no one was placed in any imaginary danger, a fact confirmed by the Gardaí present. Mr. Ward then accuses me of making defamatory statements about members of staff who he insists are just trying to do their jobs. It's not defamatory if it's true. Isn't that correct, Frank? We know that certain types don't like the truth being pointed out about who and what they really are. But unfortunately for the rogues and liars up there, speaking the truth boldly and openly is one of our best defences against the likes of Ward & Co. and all of their collaborative deceptions. Accordingly, we will keep telling the truth and will keep exposing liars and miscreants in clear, accurate and uncompromising language. Now, Mr. Ward then objects to three terms that we've used. The first two you'll be very familiar with, which are career liars and moral deviants. And then I used the term moral dirtbags in another interview, and apparently Mr. Ward is taking great umbrage at this. Now, in the letter I sent back to Mr. Ward, I explained to him the use of the term dirtbag as follows. Oh, and by the way, the term dirtbag to describe someone who makes a living out of lying and deceiving and covering up crimes and injustice for personal profit or reward is, we believe, absolutely appropriate. The bag being the human form, and the dirt being the contents in that bag. Amoral, deceitful, cowardly, odious, scheming, and invidious. Yes, Thomas, dirtbags does seem to be the appropriate metaphor for career liars and moral deviants, wouldn't you agree? Yes, these are literally accurate, albeit unflattering terms. And yes, criminal complaints have been lodged with Gardaí and with the District Court. So again, what's Mr. Ward's problem here? He actually seems to be having difficulty with anyone insisting on their lawful, fundamental rights to justice, and is also objecting, apparently, to us telling the truth in frank and uncompromising terms. Then Mr. Ward complains that I have alleged that a certain Mr. Colin Shortall has committed a criminal offence. Here we go. It's as if, right? So, yes, but this is not an allegation. This is a fact. Mr. Colin Shortall has committed a serious criminal offence, has he not? We can but apologise if all of the obfuscation and obstructionism and unlawful denials of service due by senior court service staff is holding up the progress of those criminal prosecutions, or if our complaints to the Gardaí are not being acted upon in a timely manner according to law. Perhaps Mr. Ward should use his influence and authority as the head of Superior Court operations, or perhaps they might listen to the Chief Justice or to the Minister. If they insist those valid court applications get processed and those formal criminal complaints get investigated. You see, we do actually lodge these complaints, and when we try to follow up, we just get stonewalled. The whole system has shut down. It's like they've cut out a whole section of society and are just refusing to deal with us because they have nowhere else to go with this. Then Mr. Ward complains that I recorded Mr. Shortall without his permission. Yes, I recorded him without his permission for two reasons. Number one, I don't need his permission to record him lawfully. And number two, the purpose for the recording is to collect evidence of criminal offences for the purposes of lawfully prosecuting those crimes. So again, what's Mr. Ward's problem here? Maybe he should be a tad more concerned that Shortall, Tracy, Gorgon, Denning and others up there are knowingly committing criminal offences by association or otherwise, either directly or indirectly. Then he goes on to say he tries to cover up the fact that the guards were surrounding the forecourts on the last occasion we went up there as a group, and we were looking for an escort and we couldn't find any because they were all there to try to stop us going into the courts. He then tries to claim that they had to put a ring of steel around the courts to defend the other court users and so on. Actually, it was us who requested a Garda escort in advance to protect us from the criminal intentions of Justice Michael McGrath and co. The fact that they responded, the guards, to a request from a criminally compromised member of the court service, but not to a request from law-abiding members of the public, tells its own sorry story. So, what was Mr. Ward ostensibly protecting everyone from? Why doesn't he say it plainly? That he was worried that a group of law-abiding citizens might finally get sick to the back teeth of all of this venal corruption and deception up there at the forecourts, and might, just might, have every lawful right to start taking matters lawfully into their own hands. Mr. Ward then talks about providing a service to the public, a proper service, and so on and so forth. Mr. Ward is surely taking the proverbial here. What about my entitlement to a proper service from the court service? What about their obligations to the law, to the Constitution, and to myself as a bona fide customer of the courts? The hypocrisy and duplicity here is astounding. Here, Mr. Ward attempts to imply that there was some ominous threat to the safety of court service staff and to other court users. My oh my, how terribly scary for everyone that Manning, if we are to believe Mr. Ward's insinuations, is bringing this bloodthirsty mob of polite law-abiding members of the public to respectfully but firmly insist upon their inalienable rights to the rule of law. But clearly, the cartel isn't comfortable when ordinary members of the public insist that they do their jobs right. So they use the age-old ruse of projecting unfounded fears and suspicions onto their accusers. Better to paint a dark picture here and try to present these determined members of the public as some sort of mortal threat to innocent others, despite the fact that in 12 years of pro-justice activism, we have never, not once, laid hands on anyone. So from where has Mr. Ward conjured up this purported danger, if not from his own perverse and corrupted imagination? Then Mr. Ward suggests that we are putting people in peril, to which I respond. Oh, give us a break, Mr. Ward. Couldn't you come up with any more dramatically alarming terms? Perhaps you should consider going into theatre. Apparently, they are always looking for drama queens for their pantomimes. Unacceptable to whom, Mr. Ward? To you or to the public who pay your exorbitant wages? Frankly, we couldn't give a hoot as to what you or any other proscribed individual declares is unacceptable. What, are we supposed to cower in apologetic apoplexy at the notion that we have done something unacceptable to offend your distorted sensibilities? What's really unacceptable, Thomas, is having a bunch of career liars and moral deviants masquerading as officers of the court. People who are not doing their jobs, by the way, unless that job is to further lies and deceptions. Equally unacceptable is your unmitigated hubris and hypocrisy. When you abandoned your morality, Thomas, you lost all credibility and standing, as well as any respect we had for you, including any perceived privileges you may have had, self-endowed or not, to presume to lecture or admonish us. You still don't get it, do you, Thomas? You have no authority over us. If court service staff are foolish enough to continue serving under you when they know you are a proscribed individual, well, that's up to them. All you are doing now is making yourself even more irrelevant and ridiculous, because now that the People's Tribunal is up and running, we have an alternative, do we not? And this part was in response to, this notion that he can somehow ban me from going up to the forecourts. Who cares? Do me a favour, frankly, guys. I've long since given up any hope or expectation of getting justice up there, and which again is why we now have set up the People's Tribunal of Ireland. Oh, so now it's my behaviour, is it, Mr. Ward? My honest, direct and uncompromising behaviour that simply expects public servants such as yourself to do their jobs. We understand that this sort of unacceptable behaviour, requiring that you respect the law, for example, is anathema to career liars and duplicitous, soulless sycophants. But in case you still don't get it, Thomas, that's the whole point here. We want to interfere in your lies, your deceptions, your forgeries, your duplicity, your collusions and criminal cover-ups. So thank you for confirming that this tactic is in fact working. Putting the safety and welfare of the public at risk. More silly lies and inflammatory nonsense, Mr. Ward, as well you know. If there is even one fragment of truth in all of these outlandish allegations of purported wrongdoing on our part, then please do take the appropriate action under the law. And we should all be asking ourselves, guys, if our behaviour is so shockingly awful and terrible, and the things that we're doing warrant Mr. Ward to think that he can actually ban us from going up to the forecourts, then where are the grounds, where are the lawful or criminal grounds for him to be making any complaints at all? The truth of the matter is he doesn't have any. And even if he did, even if they were to try and squeeze out or concoct some sort of an offence by us being uncompromising and demanding that we get our rights respected, they'd then have to open up Pandora's box, because all of this other stuff that's mentioned in the Criminality book would have to be put on the table. And they're not going to do that. Then Mr. Ward tells me I can use the post to get my documents sent into them, as opposed to going up and getting an appointment and getting... Aha! So now we're back to using the post as a means for lodging court documents. How very convenient an arrangement, Thomas, for you and your scheming lackeys to continue what you've been doing recently. For example, ignoring documents, suppressing documents, and then returning them in the post, unstamped, unsigned, and unfiled, while simultaneously denying us access in person through an appointment in the central office. This way, you can always falsely claim not to have received posted documents, right? Another venal ruse that's a total non-runner if we're standing right there in the central office with copies in hand, right? So to put it simply, guys, they want us now only to communicate by post so that they can disappear the documents or delay them, hold them up, or decide not to issue them. You know, whereas if we're in there in person, obviously, it's far more difficult for them to reject us if we're standing there with an appointment, documents in hand. But it seems that any venal act of criminality is up for grabs these days. Then he talks about continuing the brilliant service that they've been providing us, Continue what, Mr. Ward? Continue to obstruct, deceive, and refuse us service? Where is the purported judgment of Michael McGrath of May the 18th that we need to prosecute him and the Irish Times for conspiracy? They're still holding on to that, guys, right? It's a couple of months ago now. They won't produce the document. That's one of the ways that they eternally obstruct us. They just stop the case going forwards. And there's nothing we can do about it because they've got the document, and if they don't stamp and issue it, what else can I do? Your letter is so pathetically asinine, contrived, and duplicitous as to be borderline moronic. And yes, Thomas, we will be making this matter very public, whether you like it or not. Now back to Mr. Clark. Last couple of sentences, lads. The only thing left to say to you, Mr. Clark, in your role as Chief Justice and as Chair of the Court Service Board, is where on earth are you getting these people from? Are they being hired in the first place because they are corrupt? Or does that come with the training? Because clearly, you have an epidemic of lies and deceptions and of liars and deceivers up there at the forecourts. And the great and lasting question that will follow you into retirement, Frank, is why on earth you have done nothing about it during your tenure, even when you are obliged to do so under the law. Another person committing criminal offences, in other words. That's our Chief Justice. Wonderful, isn't it? Don't worry, Frank, we're not expecting any proper, honest response to that one. But Mr. Ward will be receiving a bill for wasting our valuable time, and you, Frank, may expect to receive a summons to the People's Tribunal in the event they conduct another Article 40.1 inquiry into these matters. Trusting the position is clear, please acknowledge receipt, etc., etc. I hope the letter speaks for itself. I'll wrap up by saying the adjudicators in the Article 40.1 hearing that was held at the CCJ nearly 2 weeks ago, they've sent back the responses. The Council is processing those, and we should have a final determination from the Council soon. At that point, we'll then keep everybody informed of what we're going to do next. Okay. Now, finally, guys, I'll just say that all of these things, I know that most of the messages and the videos and the speeches that we give are to do with corruption in the courts, in the legal profession, in the guards, up in the houses of the Oireachtas and stuff like that. But it is all part of the bigger picture, guys. We've got to understand that the role of the Justice Department in particular, that's our safeguard. They're supposed to be the people that we go to when they start bringing in tyrannical COVID regulations and forced vaccinations and imprisoning us in our homes and the like. Okay, so it's important that all of you keep abreast of what's going on. We are working on COVID-related issues as well, restriction-related issues in particular, and we will shortly have our book, Crisis, Cull or Coup, What, How and Who, Exposing the Great Lie, etc., etc. Watch out for that, guys. I think that will be an eye-opener for many. Thanks again for listening, guys, and let's keep working together, because one by one, together, we can make a difference.